Hey guys, tonight we're drifting backward, far beyond the age of motorways, GPS signals, or reliable post. We're heading into the soft fog of medieval Europe where messages traveled by saddle, fortunes rattled inside creaking carts, and one missed delivery could reshape an entire season. So settle in, maybe turn the lights low, let the world outside your room fade away, and close your eyes if you like. You're about to meet a man you've never heard of, but whose footprints once trailed through the frost-bitten forests of Burgundy, carting barrels of wine and the weight of a promise. His name was Gerault of Mersault, and though his name never found a chronicle, nor his face a fresco, his life was real in the way worn hands and half-mended boots always are. The year is 1286, and the world smells like wood smoke, wet wool, and fermenting grapeskins. You are not in a grand hall or a scholar's cloister, but a modest loading yard just outside Dijon. Winter clings to the soil. Frost lingers on fence posts, and there, wrapped in a patchwork of cloak, furs, and quiet determination, stands Gerault. He is not young anymore, not really. His beard is greying at the chin, and his joints groan when he leans too hard into the axle of the cart. But in the world of wine hauling, that only makes him reliable, trusted, careful. He had just loaded the last of the oak barrels, sloshing gently with the deep red vintage from last summer's harvest, pressed at an abbey just north of Mersault. This was no common vinegar wine. It had body. It had story. It had been ordered specially by the Benedictine monastery of Saint-Léonard, far to the west near Tours. And it was Gerault's burden and pride to carry it safely there. The roads, of course, would be less road and more rutted memory of one. He had a sturdy cart drawn by 2 oxen, with bells tied around their necks to ward off thieves, and P.S. loneliness. He also carried a staff, a knife, a wineskin, and a roll of smoked pork for the road. Simple fare for simple travel, but no journey in 13th century France was simple, and everyone at the yard knew it. "Gerault," said an old cooper from behind a stack of barrels, voice wheezy from years of sawdust and wine vapours. "You'll want to make the crossing at Le Pont Rouge before the rains come. If the stream rises..." Well, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In these parts, bad timing could mean more than a delay. It could mean getting stuck for weeks, or worse, washed out entirely. Gerault nodded without much fuss. He'd made the journey a dozen times, but never so deep into the darkening months. Never quite so alone. His usual travel companion, a wiry young lad named Benoit, had taken sick. Rattling cough, pale skin. Gerault suspected the sweat plague and told him to stay home, rest, pray, or whatever it was young men did when their lungs filled with ghosts. This time it would be just him, the oxen, and the road. He set out that morning with low clouds brushing the hilltops and the chill crawling down from the Alps like a curious cat. The cart creaked familiarly under the weight. He wrapped his wool cloak tighter and let the rhythm of the oxen guide his thoughts. He passed fields now sleeping, their rows empty of vines or barley. The trees stood like grey sentries, branches bare, as if holding their breath for spring. He passed a hovel where smoke rose from a crooked chimney and a little girl waved without smiling. That was how winter was. No one had extra energy to waste on smiles. But the wave meant something. He answered it with a nod. Hours blurred, the road dipped and twisted. Mud, then frost, then gravel, then mud again. Always the soft thudding of hooves, always the sound of barrels shifting gently with the sway. It was meditative. Hypno. Tick. But by mid-afternoon, the first signs of unease arrived. A cart wheel caught in a hollow too deep. He had to lift the axle with a log while muttering prayers to St. Christopher. His back screamed for a rest he couldn't afford. Later, one of the oxen slipped on a patch of ice, landing awkwardly. It rose with a grunt, but Gerault could tell the step afterward was uneven. He didn't panic, he didn't curse, just reached for the salted oats and spoke to the beast softly, as he had for years. "Easy now, Belle. There's warmth and hay at the next stop. We keep moving, that's all we ever do." And they did. That night, he reached a small wayhouse run by nuns, more barn than inn, but it offered a roof and something like soup. The sisters were quiet, their chapel flickering with beeswax light. They welcomed Gerault with a warm nod, a shallow bowl of lentils, and bread so stale it could anchor ships. He thanked them nonetheless, and curled up beside his oxen in the straw-lined corner, boots still on, knife at his hip. The wind howled outside, scraping at the shutter like a hungry animal. Inside, the warmth of bodies and beasts kept the cold at bay, for now. As Gerault drifted into uneasy sleep, his last thoughts weren't of danger or coin, but of the order slip tucked carefully in the pocket of his tunic. It was inked in careful Latin, sealed with red wax. A promise, 20 barrels arrive by Candlemas. He would keep that promise. Unless the road had other plans. The morning after that first night was grey as boiled wool, the sky thick with the kind of clouds that promised something wet, rain, snow, or just a drizzle of misery. Gerault rose before the bells, joints stiff, spine making a slow protest. He murmured thanks to the sisters, though they were already cloistered in whispered dawn prayers, and checked the oxen. Belle's limp was still present, but not worse. That would have to be enough. He eased the cart back onto the road, whispering, steady encouragement as the wheels groaned through half-frozen mud. A gust of wind caught his hood and carried with it the scent of wood smoke, dung, and something sour, cheese perhaps, or simply the breath of December. By mid-morning, he passed a charcoal burner's camp, blackened stumps ringed in soot, with wisps of white smoke still curling lazily from a banked fire. No one was there, just the ashes and a pair of old boots abandoned beside a mossy log. Gerault did not stop. In these hills, pausing could invite trouble, and anyway, the barrels needed to be delivered. Time was thickening like stew. Candlemas crept ever closer. As he descended into a valley, the road improved briefly, worn by carts hauling firewood into nearby villages. He passed hedgerows dusted with frost, saw a fox dart into the brush, and caught sight of a cloaked traveller on foot, headed in the opposite direction. They exchanged nods, no words. Speaking on the road was a thing for summer. In winter, one saved breath for the hill. That night, he reached the outskirts of a town called La Motte, too small to appear on most maps, but large enough to have a tavern that doubled as a stable. The warmth hit him like a blow. Inside it smelled of roasted turnips, wet boots, and a dozen conversations swirling in low, ale-soaked voices. He ordered broth and a bit of rye bread, placing 2 coppers on the table with the quiet solemnity of someone spending more than they should. At the next table sat a pair of salt merchants, one young, smooth-faced and talkative, the other older, with a nose red as a beet and fingers that shook from either age or old injuries. They nodded at Gerault. "Wine hauler?" the younger asked. Gerault grunted assent between spoonfuls. "Dangerous time for it," said the elder, scratching his beard. "Flood took out the bridge near Montguillon. You'll have to ford at Le Noir, or loop south through Serene." Gerault chewed slowly, then drank. Changing course would add a day, maybe two, but frozen rivers were treacherous. He would think on it. He slept in the loft that night, wedged between a pile of hay and a sack of onions, listening to the wind press against the shutters like a drunk trying to be let in. Dreams came half-formed, voices from barrels, monks with red wax seals, the toll of a bell far off and hollow. By dawn, frost etched every surface in white. The oxen's breath came in thick clouds and the cart wheels crunched as he pulled away from La Motte. The detour weighed on his mind, but he trusted the salt merchant's word. He veered south at the fork, passing under skeletal trees and through a cluster of cottages with roofs like heavy brows. Later that afternoon, it began to snow, not a gentle fall, but the kind that arrives angry, with flakes like rags and a wind that nipped like a bored hound. Gerault pulled his hood low, eyes narrowing against the stinging gusts. Visibility shrank to nothing. The road vanished beneath a growing white silence. He stopped by a leaning milestone, nearly invisible under ice. His oxen stamped nervously. A decision had to be made. To push forward meant crossing Col d'Arbel, a narrow ridge path flanked by cliffs and steep declines. It was faster, yes, but in snow. Still, backtracking meant days lost, and Candlemas would not wait. Gerault sighed, tightened his cloak, and turned toward the pass. The climb began gently enough, the road snaking upward through a forest of black trunks and white branches. But as the elevation increased, so did the cold. Snow crusted on his sleeves. His hands went numb inside their leather mitts. One barrel shifted slightly. He stopped and checked the ropes. Still secure. Above the tree line, wind howled unchecked. The pass stretched before him like a thread across the shoulders of the world. To the left, a steep drop vanished into mist. To the right, a rock wall streaked with icicles. He urged the oxen forward, slowly, carefully. Hooves slight, peeped once, twice. He steadied them with a murmured prayer to Saint Martin, protector of travellers. Ice cracked beneath the cart's wheels. One barrel creaked, ominous. Then came the moment. A shriek, not of animal nor man, but wood. The rear axle snapped. It was not dramatic. Just a sound like a bone breaking under snow. The cart listed. A barrel rolled, hit the side rail and stopped, miraculously. Gerault froze. One wrong movement now, and the entire load could tumble down the slope, dragging the oxen, or him, with it. He slid off the bench and crouched low, hands probing beneath the cart. The brake was clean. The wheel hung useless, repairable, yes, but not here, not in this wind, not in this place. He looked back along the road. The snow was already covering their tracks. Night was coming. He needed shelter. Leaving the cart, he trudged along the edge of the pass for several dozen paces, praying to find a rock outcrop, a cave, even a hollow tree. What he found was older. A ruined shrine, half buried, stones fallen inward like a collapsed lung, once dedicated perhaps to St. Hubert or some forgotten local guardian. But the roof still held, barely. Enough to keep out wind, enough to make camp. He returned to the cart, unhitched the oxen, led them to the shelter, and tethered them near the stone wall, spreading straw from a burst sack for warmth. Then he returned, barrel by barrel, carrying 2 into the shrine with all the reverence of a priest handling relics. The rest he covered with canvas and snow, hoping the wind wouldn't claim them. As darkness thickened, he lit a scrap of waxed cloth for a flame and crouched inside the shrine beside the barrels, hands trembling from cold, fatigue, and a quiet knot of fear he refused to name. His breath curled like smoke. In the flickering light, the old stones whispered a story of forgotten saints and travellers who never made it through. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would decide. Tonight, he would endure. By morning, the storm had quieted, though its footprints remained in thick drifts and brittle ice lacing the broken stones of the pass. Gerault stirred from sleep with the stiffness of a statue, wrapped in wool and silence. The oxen had survived the night, bellies sunken but eyes bright. The barrels, those left behind, were still there, half buried like sleeping sentinels. He counted them once, twice. None had been taken by wind or avalanche. Yet. But the cart, broken and hunched at the bend of the ridge, was no longer usable. Gerault stared at it for a long time, jaw clenched. He had tools, rope, wedge, axe, but no tree to cut, no wheel to mend with. Repair would take days. The pass would take back what it could by then. He had to choose. Leave the barrels? All of them? Impossible. Leave some, carry the rest. A fool's gamble. And yet, the monastery, Candlemas, the contract. He knelt, picked up the wax-sealed order slip again, red wax, now cracked at the edge from cold. He held it close to the little shrine fire, rereading the Latin that he could barely understand, but knew by heart. 20 barrels, red vintage, delivered in honor of St. Benedict's Day, paid in silver upon arrival. Failure meant nothing, not in legal terms. He would not be dragged before a court. But it would stain his name quietly forever. No more contracts, no more trust. He would become that hauler, the one who lost the wine, the one who didn't arrive. So Gerault, with stiff fingers and a heart like lead, began to plan. By noon, he had fashioned a sled of sorts, half the cart bed lashed with rope and reinforced with a barrel stave. He loaded 6 barrels onto it. No more. Any more would break the rig, or him. He left the rest behind, hidden under snow, marked by a ragged, red scarf tied to a bent pine just down the slope. If he made it to the next village, he could hire help, return with hands, wheels, and warmth. If the descent was brutal, the slope dipped sharply, the path barely wide enough for the sled. He walked beside it, sometimes behind, sometimes guiding the oxen slowly down, one step at a time. They slipped twice. Gerault did too. He bled from the knee, then the hand, but wrapped both without pause. He reached the tree line as the sun fell. Below him, forest, smoke in the air, a settlement, small but alive. He would make it. And he did. The hamlet of Fontelieu wasn't on any wine route. It was too remote, too poor, but it had roofs and fire and the ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Gerault arrived limping, his oxen caked in ice, his sled slumped like a wounded soldier. He knocked on the door of the smithy with the last strength in his shoulders. A woman answered, her face lined, eyes sharp, arms coated in soot. She did not smile. "You need a cart," she said before he could ask. "I need help," he replied, voice frayed like old rope. They struck a deal. She would lend him a cart and a boy to help load. In return, she'd keep one of the barrels, not silver, but worth enough in wine-starved winter. He nodded. Deal. That night, he sat beside her hearth, cup of bitter broth in hand, warming his feet for the first time in 3 days. The boy, René, asked questions between bites of flatbread. Where was he going? What was in the barrels? Had he ever seen the sea? Gerault answered softly, the way travelers do, offering truth in measured spoons. The next morning, they climbed back into the snow. Retrieving the rest of the barrels took a full day. The sled cracked once, but the borrowed cart held. They loaded carefully, one by one, like relics. René's fingers turned purple. Gerault gave him his mittens. When they reached Fontelieu again, it was near dusk. The woman took her payment in silence, nodding once. "Saint Benedict bless you," she said, not unkindly. Gerault replied, "And only may the road treat you kinder than the ridge," and he set off again. The road from Fontelieu westward was longer but kinder. The valleys had thawed. Villages grew more frequent. He passed shepherds and nuns, tinkers and monks on foot, a leper singing psalms with a voice like broken glass. He gave what bread he could. He drank melted snow from cupped hands. He slept in stables, barns, once even under the eaves of a smithy's roof, while rain painted the world silver. And slowly, slowly, Tours approached. When he saw the spires of Saint-Léonard, Gerault almost didn't believe them. The oxen did. They picked up pace on instinct. He rode the last hill in silence. The monastery stood as it always had, stone walls, ringing bells, the smell of incense and firewood. He passed through the gate, drawing stares from the monks as the cart groaned into the courtyard. A brother stepped forward, younger than Gerault, clean hands, red wax seal in hand. "You're late." Gerault reached into his cloak, pulled out the order slip, handed it over without a word. The monk read, compared, looked at the cart, counted barrels. "Only 19, he said. Gerault nodded. "One lost to a smith for rescue." A pause. Then the monk shrugged. "Still drinkable?" They were buried in snow, cold as saints' bones, safer than any cellar. Another pause. Then, "Come in, hauler. We'll feed your beasts, and, perhaps, share a cup." That night, Gerault sat in the monk's quarters, bowl of stew in hand. He was clean, warm, and quiet. No words needed. Just silence and a cup of the wine he had carried across half of France. It was good, deep, honest. He slept in a spare cot in the cloister guest room, belly full, body aching. And in the morning, he left. No celebration, no plaque, no coin beyond the agreed silver. But his name would pass quietly, monk to monk, the hauler who came through the pass, the one who didn't quit, the one who brought the wine when the wine was lost. And in some way, that was enough. He left the monastery without ceremony. The coins, wrapped in oilcloth, rested deep in his pouch, heavy enough to promise comfort, light enough to feel earned. Gerault didn't linger. He never did. Too many barrels in his life had taught him that stillness was for those with less to carry. The oxen, fed and brushed by the monks, moved with renewed calm through the streets of Tours, hooves striking the cobbles with a rhythm steadier than prayer. The city buzzed faintly around him, vendors calling out roots and dried apples, beggars with cracked voices, the clatter of boots from a nearby patrol. But Gerault kept his eyes low, past the steeples, past the tradesmen, past the piles of winter straw shoveled into the gutter. His path led him east again, though not along the same trail. That route, the one through Col d'Arbel, belonged to snow and ghosts now. He would follow the southern roads, longer, yes, but wider and less prone to ambush from the weather. That night he stopped in a village where the church had no bell, and the inn smelled faintly of cabbage and wet shoes. The tavern keeper eyed him wearily until he mentioned the abbey, and then served him a bowl of something that may have once been stew. Gerault ate it all. In the loft above the animals, wrapped in his blanket, he stared at the rafters. Not from discomfort, not even from thought. Just habit. His body rested, but his mind drifted in old ruts, broken axles, snowbound ridges, the feeling of the shrine stones under his back. He wondered briefly whether any travellers had found the rest of the barrels he'd buried. Perhaps they were still there. Perhaps they would remain there forever, until some curious future hand unearthed them and tasted the dust of his failure. He turned over on the straw, pulled the blanket tight, and let the noise of snoring cattle cradle him. By the time he reached the town of Chauvigny 3 days later, the weather had warmed. Not by much, but enough to melt the crust of frost along the trees and let the mud drink sunlight again. People were moving, markets reopened, children with red noses ran along fences. His oxen stepped lighter. So did he. In Chauvigny, he found what he wasn't looking for. A letter. Folded, wax-sealed, addressed to no one at first glance. But inside the seal, pressed faintly into the red, a mark he recognized. Benoit's. The boy he'd left behind, coughing and pale, weeks ago. A merchant, passing west, had carried it halfway before forgetting about it in the lining of a saddlebag. It arrived rumpled, crinkled, but intact. Gerault read it with his back to the town square, beside the forge, sun warming the top of his hood. Benoit was alive. Sick still, but recovering. The letter was halting, uneven in script, with gaps where the ink had faded or the boy's hand had trembled. But he had written it. With effort. With hope. "Did you bring the barrels?" he asked at the end. Gerault folded the letter, held it in his gloved hands, and said nothing for a long time. He stayed in Chauvigny that night, not for need, but to write a reply. He bought a scrap of parchment from the church clerk, a borrowed quill, and a bit of bitter ink that stank like old iron. He sat in the tavern corner and scratched out a message in plain words. "Yes, I brought them." He didn't mention the snow. The shrine? The cold that chewed his fingers. He didn't mention the lost barrels or the sled of desperation. He just told the boy, yes. Then he asked after the cough and told him to rest and said nothing else. By morning, the oxen were ready, their breaths steaming in the air like clouds from a tired forge. He handed the letter to a passing monk heading north. They'd get it there, sooner or later. Letters had their own kind of journey. He travelled on, through woods that whispered again with birds, across a field where sheep turned slowly toward the passing cart, through a narrow village whose only tavern bore a sign shaped like a broken spoon. Everywhere he went, there was motion now. Wagons, traders, pilgrims, Lent was approaching, and the roads, long frozen with silence, began to thaw under the feet of those who hungered. And everywhere, wine was spoken of like gold. At a roadside market, he heard two men arguing over a barrel sold by a merchant from Fontelieu. Too thin, one said. Watered down. Still better than last year's vinegar, said the other. Gerault kept walking. He passed a blind fiddler playing near the bridge at Montmorillon, his music thin but sincere. He paused, dropped a copper into the old man's bowl, and waited for the tune to end before walking on. Later that evening, just outside the hamlet of Bruere, he saw a flicker of movement by the side of the road. A young man, no more than 20, limping, one shoe missing, eyes wide with hope or hunger. Gerault stopped. The boy didn't speak, just looked at the cart, then at him, then at the sky, as if asking permission of all three. "Climb up," Gerault said simply. The boy did, slowly. No thanks, just motion. His hands shook. Gerault handed him a piece of dried pork and a crust of bread. They didn't speak again until the moon had risen high over the fields. "Where are you going?" the boy finally asked. "East," said Gerault. "To where?" Gerault shrugged. "Somewhere with a roof, somewhere with barrels, always barrels." The boy laughed softly, then coughed. Not the same as Benoit's cough, not yet. They travelled together in silence. Sometimes the boy asked questions, sometimes he slept beside the oxen. Sometimes he sang. Gerault said little, but he did listen, and that, somehow, made the road seem less long. They passed through lowlands where mist clung to the ground, like breath held too long. The boy, who eventually told Gerault his name was Etienne, proved to be light with words but quick with his hands. He fed the oxen without needing to be asked. He patched the canvas when it frayed. He even adjusted the ropes that held the cart's rear axle steady, using a smooth stone and a worn piece of leather to wedge the looseness firm. Gerault didn't say much in praise, but Etienne seemed to understand that silence in this world could mean trust. One night, they sheltered in the loft of an abandoned mill. The grindstone had long cracked, its teeth worn down to nothing, but the beams still held against the wind. Etienne started a fire with dried reeds and a pinch of lamp oil Gerault had kept in a leather pouch since before the monastery. They roasted onions, scavenged from a roadside bundle someone had likely dropped, and shared the last of the salt pork. "I didn't mean to leave home," Etienne said that night, eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. Gerault said nothing, but shifted to pass him a wineskin. "It was loud all the time," the boy continued. "Arguments. My uncle drank too much. The cows were thin. Then I took the mule to fetch flour one morning. and just didn't go back. Gerault took the wineskin back, sipped, and handed it again. "My mother cried when I left once before," the boy whispered, "but this time I don't think she knew I was gone." Gerault looked at the fire. They always know. Silence, but a softer one, the kind that comes not from absence, but from understanding. In the morning, the frost had melted down the mill walls in long weeping trails. They packed, adjusted the rigging, and rolled on. They crossed into the foothills of the lower Vosges, where the land turned uneven and the sky narrowed between ridges. There were fewer villages here, just hamlets, tucked against woods, stone paths that vanished into moss, and birds that watched from branches like quiet sentries. At a stream near the base of a hill, Gerault stopped to wash the oxen's hooves and refill the water skins. Etienne wandered upriver, whistling. When he returned, his eyes were alight. "There's a camp," he said, "just past the birch grove. Traders, I think. They have bread." Gerault followed. It was not a trader's camp exactly, more a gathering of pilgrims waiting out the thaw. Their clothes were muddy, their faces wind-burned, and most looked half exhausted. But there was bread, and dried apples, and someone was roasting chestnuts in a cracked iron pot. Gerault exchanged a coin for 3 loaves and gave 2 to Etienne. The boy tore his with a hunger that made no effort to be polite. The crust crackled, the inside was dense, spongy, faintly sour. It was the best meal they'd had in a week. A woman by the fire, wrapped in a shawl the color of river clay, spoke to Gerault between bites. "You from Tours?" He shook his head. "Been there, not from there." "Going home?" "No," he said. Then after a pause, "Going forward." She laughed, not mocking, more like a wheeze caught in her throat. "Aren't we all?" They stayed only long enough to warm their feet and let the oxen rest. Before dusk, they were back on the trail. Etienne had tucked a piece of the chestnut loaf into his coat, chewing it slowly between songs half remembered from his mother's kitchen. Later that evening they passed a crossroads, marked only by a wooden pole, bent slightly eastward. A crow perched atop it, staring like a judge. Beneath it, a pile of stones, perhaps a shrine, or perhaps just the remains of an old border mark. Gerault stopped there. He placed 1 stone more upon the pile. Etienne asked, "What's it for?" "Reminding," said Gerault. "Of what?" Gerault looked up at the darkening sky. "That we were here." They moved on without speaking. That night, they camped beneath a wide oak, its branches bare but proud. The stars returned in full above them, scattered and blinking like lanterns forgotten by giants. Etienne fell asleep with his head against a sack of barley flour, a gift from a passing miller. Gerault sat with his back to the cartwheel, eyes half shut, half guarding. He thought of the pass again, of the shrine, of barrels still frozen under snow. Then, softly, he smiled, because tomorrow the road would continue, and so would he. The road the next day curled down into a stretch of marshland, where the ruts were slick and the air clung damp around the ankles. Frogs croaked from hidden pools, and reeds hissed softly in the breeze like monks whispering secrets. Gerault kept to the narrowest part of the track, steering the oxen with calm murmurs and steady hands. Etienne walked beside him barefoot, boots slung over one shoulder, claiming it helped him feel the earth. they made slow progress. At one point, a wheel slipped deep into a patch of muck, and both of them had to brace against the cart to pull it free, their breaths sharp, their arms trembling. Etienne grunted, swore, then grinned like it had been a game. Gerault, by contrast, said nothing. He simply brushed the mud from his cloak and checked the ropes again. Toward noon, they reached a tiny crossing, a single wooden beam bridging a sluggish creek. On the far side stood a lone man, robed and barefoot, holding a staff with a bell on it. A leper. He didn't speak, just rang the bell once. A gentle chime like a spoon tapped against a bowl. Etienne tensed, but Gerault raised a hand to still him. Slowly, he reached into his pack and drew out a small pouch. Inside, a folded piece of linen wrapped around 3 dried figs. He approached, keeping distance, and placed the pouch on a stone halfway across the bridge. The leper nodded once. The bell rang again, and then he turned and disappeared into the reeds. They crossed quietly after that. That night, they stopped near a ruined watchtower, its top long crumbled into ivy. They built a small fire beneath a leaning arch, and Etienne climbed the lowest stones, claiming he could see the moon better from there. Gerault sat against a mossy wall, chewing on cold turnips and letting the fire warm his knees. He thought of Benoit again. In some way, Etienne filled the space the boy had left, but they were different souls. Benoit had been precise, quiet, cautious. Etienne was restless, wild in a kind way. Like a dog that had once been beaten but still chased butterflies. Gerault didn't need them to be the same. He just needed the road not to be empty. Before they slept, Etienne asked softly, "Do you ever stop?" Gerault opened one eye. "Stop what?" "Hauling. Walking. Roads. Don't you ever stay?" The old hauler stared at the fire for a long time before answering. "No one stays, they just pretend longer." Etienne didn't reply. But in the way he rolled over, tugging the blanket tight, Gerault could tell the words had landed somewhere. They were back on the road at first light. As they travelled eastward, the terrain began to rise again. Gentle hills first, then sharper inclines. The villages grew scarcer, the air colder. Gerault recognized the shift in stone, the types of trees, the smells of pine and frozen moss. They were nearing Meursault. Not quite home, but close enough for memory to tap at his shoulders. They passed a chapel perched above a stream, roof sagging, but cross still upright. Bells hung silent. A white cat sat in the archway watching them like it had been waiting all winter. At the next fork, they passed a signpost with faded lettering, Meursault, 17 leagues. Gerault's fingers tightened around the reins. The boy noticed. "Is that where you're from?" Gerault didn't answer. Instead, he stopped the cart. They camped early that evening under a row of hawthorns, the blossoms still curled in tight green fists. Etienne carved a flute from a hollow branch and tried to play it, laughing when it wheezed. Gerault sat with his back to the wheel, watching the road behind them disappear into dusk. He hadn't planned to return to Meursault. But it seemed the road had decided otherwise. They entered Meursault just as the church bells marked the Angelus, their notes carried thin and uncertain across the early morning fog. The town had not changed in the way that people think towns change. The walls were still damp with the breath of old winters. The stone paths still echoed faintly beneath the hooves of returning beasts. but there were new doors where there had once been none, and old shutters, freshly painted where once they'd hung, crooked. Gerault's cart clattered into the main square with the same slow rhythm it always had. A few faces looked up. One or two seemed to pause, squinting. They knew the oxen first. Then the man. Then the weight of years pressed down. He did not linger in the square. He turned the cart toward the back road that ran behind the cooper's yard, past the baker who no longer rose early enough to make the whole street smell like crust. Etienne glanced around as they passed, sensing a tension in Gerault's posture, but saying nothing. The boy had learned when to fill the air and when to leave it hollow. Gerault halted the oxen before a low house built of stone and thatch, set behind a modest fence of ashwood. The garden was mostly weeds. The door, warped from time, hung just slightly askew. He stepped down from the cart. Etienne followed, quiet. The house looked smaller than it had in memory. The walls, once thick and wide, seemed fragile now, like bones showing through the skin of time. Gerault knocked once, nothing. He knocked again. Still silence. He tried the serene latch. It gave. The door opened with a groan, and cool air spilled out. Inside, the house was dim, but not abandoned. A table with 2 chairs, a hearth swept clean. A pot hung from a hook, filled with dry herbs. Someone lived here still, or had recently. He stepped inside, boots on the same stones he'd crossed 1,000 times before. Then a voice from behind. "You should have written." He turned. There she stood, Marianne, his sister. Hair braided back the way their mother had taught. Wrinkles deeper than before, but her eyes still steady, still sharper than any chisel in town. "I didn't think—" he began, but stopped. There was no right way to end that sentence. "You didn't think," she said flatly. They stood in silence. Etienne lingered in the doorway, uncertain. Marianne finally stepped forward, took Gerault by the wrist, and tugged him gently toward the hearth. "You're thinner," she muttered. "You're greyer. And you still smell like ox." They sat. She poured a bit of cider from a cracked jug and placed it between them. He drank. It was tart, old, and familiar. "You bringing wine again?" she asked, glancing toward the cart. "Delivered already." She nodded once. They talked little that day. Words came slowly, like the first drops of a thaw, but by nightfall Etienne was asleep in the loft, and Gerault was stirring lentils over the hearth, while Marianne mended a tear in the sleeve of his cloak. The next morning, she handed him a loaf of bread and a clean scarf. "Stay," she said. Not a command, not a plea, just the shape of a choice laid gently in front of him. "I might," he replied. And he meant it. But after 2 days, the road began whispering again. He rose before the bells, checked the cart, fed the oxen. When Marianne came to the door, he was already tying the last strap. She didn't ask why. She just handed him a pouch of dried cherries and said, "Don't forget, oh, come back." He nodded. Etienne climbed into the cart beside him, eyes squinting against the new dawn. "Where now?" the boy asked. Gerault looked down the path, which curved just out of sight. "Let's find out," he said. And with the gentle creak of wheels and the soft breath of oxen, they moved on, into the fog, into the future, into whatever part of the world still waited to be crossed. The road east from Meursault was not the road west had been. It was quieter, broader, more forgiving in slope, but somehow lonelier in spirit. Perhaps it was because each step no longer pointed toward home, or because the land seemed stripped bare after winter's long breath. Trees stood in cold silence, their branches still undecided about spring. Fields stretched wide but empty, sown with nothing but the patient waiting of farmers. Gerault drove the cart in silence. Etienne, once full of song and questions, seemed subdued too, perhaps sensing the shift. The boy sat on the side rail, legs dangling, hands busy carving notches into a bit of pine wood, one for each village, he claimed. A journey measured in whittled marks and road dust. They passed a wayside chapel, its door unlatched, creaking in the breeze. Gerault slowed the cart, watching as the wind stirred the faded cloth inside, blue, once rich with colour, now pale as old smoke. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. Whatever prayers he owed the road, he'd already paid in frost and sweat. That evening they camped by a stand of willow trees near a half-frozen stream. Etienne caught fish with thread and a pin, more out of pride than hunger. Gerault made a fire from damp twigs, coaxing it to life with the patience of a man who'd once waited 4 days for a barrel to thaw. As they ate, Etienne glanced toward the east. "Do you think we'll ever get there?" Gerault chewed, swallowed. "Where?" Etienne shrugged. "Wherever we're going." Gerault poked the fire with a stick. Sparks danced into the branches. "We'll know we got there when we stop walking." They didn't speak again that night. But before sleep, the boy placed his carved pine, Nessun, near the fire, the notches facing upward like stars. The days passed in quiet repetition, wood smoke, boots in mud, the low thrum of wheels on frozen dirt. They encountered fewer people now. A pair of nuns heading to a convent near the Rhine. A lone shepherd with a limp who offered them sour cheese and a story about wolves that laughed at night. And once, just once, a cart of plague doctors, masked and silent, heading westward with haste. No words were exchanged, just a grim nod, and the scent of vinegar trailing behind. In a hollow between 2 hills they passed the broken remains of an old inn. Only the chimney stood, pointing upward like a warning finger. Etienne climbed over the stones, found a rusted horseshoe, and tucked it into his coat. "Good luck," he said. Gerault didn't argue. He was old enough to know luck came in all shapes, and left just as quietly. They crossed the edge of a village called Arbois, where the smell of fresh bread wafted from a bakery, with windows still glazed in frost. The baker's wife offered them a half-loaf and a wedge of sharp cheese in exchange for a song from Etienne, who sang with the shy confidence of someone finding his voice in public for the first time. The woman clapped. The baker grinned. Gerault simply nodded and tucked the food into his pack. That night, as the stars brightened above a grove of ash trees, Etienne asked, "Why don't you ever settle?" Gerault looked into the fire. "I did, once." "What happened?" The road came back. The boy didn't push, but he listened. And that was enough. A few days later, they reached a crossing that split three ways, north toward the river trade towns, east into the Jura hills, and south where vineyards began to green again. A signpost leaned crookedly, names half faded. Gerault stood before it, brow furrowed. "Which way?" Etienne asked. Gerault looked at the sky, then at the boy, then at the oxen. "Let's follow the sun," he said. And with that, they turned south, the cart creaking behind them like a memory still trying to be remembered. The road south welcomed them with a different sort of silence, warmer, gentler, yet laced with something deeper, like the quiet breath of someone who has wept and now only waits. The earth here was softer, the winds less cruel. And there, in the distance, the first budding rows of vineyards could be seen, lines stitched across the hills like the seams of an old monk's robe. They passed carts heavier than theirs, groaning under barrels and bundles, and light wagons drawn by shaggy mules, their drivers nodding sleepily as they went. The rhythm of the land was slower here, not sleepy, not idle, just measured, like a song hummed while pruning vines. Etienne pointed toward the rows, the green tips just pushing through soil. "Wine," he said. Gerault grunted agreement. "You going to carry it again?" "Maybe," Gerault said, "if it needs carrying." They stopped near a village that clung to the edge of a hill, its roofs pitched sharply to shed the spring rains. The tavern was full of merchants awaiting news from Lyon, and the stables smelled of straw, smoke, and long conversations. A boy swept out the yard with a branch broom, humming tunelessly. Inside, a man recognized Gerault. Or rather, Gerault recognized him, a former hauler, now bent with age, sitting in the corner with a mug clasped in hands like knotted rope. "Gerault," the man said, as if naming something carved in stone. Gerault nodded, pulled a chair, and sat across from him. "Didn't think you were still walking," the man muttered, eyes narrowing with a weary kind of amusement. "I didn't think you were still drinking," Gerault replied. The man laughed, a dry rattle. "My knees don't move much, but my throat still does." They shared a drink, no words for a long time. Etienne sat by the fire, carving a new piece of wood, listening but not intruding. Later, outside, as they watered the oxen, the man hobbled up behind them. "You're going down to Avalon?" Gerault shrugged. "Maybe. There's a job there, temple wine for the bishop's table, needs moving east. They want someone steady, someone quiet." Gerault didn't answer. The man nodded as if that was answer enough. "Your name still means something." That night, as they camped beyond the village, Etienne turned to him beneath the stars. "You ever think about stopping for good?" Gerault stared up at the sky. "Sometimes. And? I never seem to do it." Etienne rolled onto his side. "What if we find somewhere worth staying?" Gerault didn't reply right away. The stars shifted behind drifting clouds. A dog barked far off, a lonely sound. "If we find a place that asks us to stay," Gerault said quietly, "we'll stay." The boy seemed to accept that. In the morning, the path would bend again, south toward Avalon, toward barrels yet to be filled, toward choices that hadn't quite formed their names. But for now, there was just the fire, the breathing of oxen, and the slow rhythm of sleep tugging at their bones. The road to Avalon was edged in early bloom, hedges tipped with white petals and fields streaked with soft green. The sun lingered longer each day now, and the frost no longer clung to wagon wheels come dawn. Birds followed them again, chittering from the branches, watching with the wary curiosity of travellers who never carried anything heavier than feathers. Gerault moved slower than he once had, not from weakness, but from precision. Every bump in the path, every rut or rise, he measured with a glance, a murmur to the oxen, a slight shift of weight. Etienne, too, had begun to notice these things. Without needing to be told, he would steady the sacks or tighten a strap. A silent apprenticeship shaped by road dust and repetition. They entered through the old gate, still marked with the faded crest of some forgotten lord. The guards didn't stop them, just waved them in with the lazy approval of men whose town had seen too many travellers to worry much about another. The wine merchant's house sat just off the market square. Large, whitewashed, with an arched cellar door that breathed out cool air and the sharp scent of fermenting grape skins. A young man in a red cap met them at the gate. "You're the hauler from Meursault?" he asked, though his tone said he already knew. Gerault nodded. "The master said to expect someone quiet," the man added with a wry smile. He led them to the back, past rows of stacked barrels, all stamped with a fleur-de-lis and numbered in chalk. Inside, servants moved like ants, rolling casks, sealing corks, brushing dust. The master himself, a tall man with dark, clever eyes, appeared from a side door. He didn't introduce himself, just gestured toward the nearest open cask. "Sample it," he said. Gerault did. It was sharp, still young, but not unpromising. "I need it taken to Saint-Étienne," the man said. 3 weeks from now. Steady ride, no freezing, no sun, no jostling, and no excuses." Gerault said nothing, but his stillness seemed to be enough. "You'll have half now," the merchant said, handing him a small pouch. "And the rest upon delivery." Etienne ran a hand along the nearest barrel, eyes wide. "Can I taste it?" he asked. The merchant raised an eyebrow. "He won't spill," Gerault said. A cup was drawn. Etienne sipped. His expression grew thoughtful, then exaggerated. "Could be sweeter," he said. The merchant laughed, more surprised than amused. "Then you'd drink it all yourself." They stayed in Avalon for 3 nights, waiting for the barrels to be sealed. They slept in the stable behind the merchant's house, which had a loft and hay that didn't scratch quite as much as usual. Etienne made friends with the cook, who fed them scraps too fine for travellers. Gerault cleaned his tools, repaired a wheel spoke, oiled the leather straps. Every task done slowly, deliberately. On the 3rd morning, as they were loading the barrels, the merchant approached again. "You're free to take the river path, or the ridge trail," he said. "River's safer, but slower. Ridge is faster and colder." Gerault glanced at the sky. "I'll follow the wind," he said. The merchant nodded. "See you in Saint-Étienne." They left just before midday, the oxen rested, the cart solid beneath them. Etienne sat higher than usual, one hand on the barrel tops, humming softly. "You think we'll make it?" he asked. Gerault looked at him, then at the road. "We're already on the way," he said. And the wheels turned again, singing their quiet wooden song as the cart rolled gently back into the wide, waiting world. The path out of Avalon coiled gently through vineyards, still slick with morning dew, the earth damp and fragrant under the warming sun. The cart moved slow, not from strain, but from reverence. These barrels were young, full of impatient wine, still whispering to themselves within the oak. Gerault knew how easily wine could spoil with too much sun, too much jostle, too much life. It had to be carried like a secret, gently, with quiet respect. They chose the river path. It ran low along the valley, beside lazy waters thick with willows. Slower, yes, but kinder. The sky hung low with silver clouds, promising shade without threat. Etienne walked beside the cart, for much of the morning, humming and flicking pebbles into the shallows. They passed a small fishing village by mid-afternoon. Children ran barefoot through puddles, trailing the cart with laughter and questions. One boy tried to climb aboard until his grandmother caught him by the collar and scolded him in a stream of patois that Gerault couldn't understand, but recognized as love in disguise. A woman waved them toward her porch and offered pickled eggs and warm bread, payment only a story. Etienne took the lead, spinning a wildly inaccurate tale of how they had once crossed a mountain with a barrel on each shoulder. Gerault said nothing, only chewed his bread and let the story drift like mist across the field. That night they camped beneath an ash tree split by lightning years ago. One half still lived, bursting with spring buds, the other stood hollow, a reminder of storms endured. Gerault built a fire low and round, placing stones to shield the warmth from the barrels. Etienne practiced his carving again, now trying to shape a face into his pine wood. "Who is it?" Gerault asked after a while. "Don't know yet," the boy replied. "Maybe it's someone we'll meet." Gerault nodded, accepting the logic. The stars winked open slowly, as if reluctant to interrupt the peace. In the days that followed, the river path offered quiet moments, a heron taking flight from the reeds, the low rumble of a distant watermill, the smell of rain before it arrived. They passed other haulers too, nodding at one another without stopping. On these roads, words were precious and rarely spent on pleasantries. Then came the boglands. They weren't marked on the merchant's map, but Gerault had a memory of them, vague, half buried from a journey years past. The road thinned to two muddy ruts flanked by pools of standing water. Frogs sang, insects buzzed. The oxen grew cautious. Etienne walked ahead, checking the depth of puddles with a long branch. They made slow progress, wheel by wheel, step by step. A single misjudgment could tip the cart, could sour the barrels, could undo everything. Halfway through, a wheel sank with a groan. Gerault stopped the oxen, pressed his hand to the wood, deep but not lost. "Unpack 2 barrels," he said. Etienne moved without argument. Together they lifted the casks off, rolling them carefully to a patch of firmer ground. Then Gerault wedged a stone beneath the axle, tied off the oxen, and began digging out the wheel with a broken board. It took the better part of an hour, sweat mingling with swamp stench, hands brown with earth, but the cart rose again. They reloaded the barrels, tightened the ropes, and moved on. By sunset, they were free of the bogs, the wheels caked in dried mud, the oxen heaving slow, but the cart intact. Gerault washed his hands in the stream, sat with his back to a tree, and closed his eyes. "You always know what to do," Etienne said, sitting beside him. "No," Gerault replied. "I just do something." "Still looks like knowing." Gerault allowed a soft huff of a laugh, his version of amusement. As they drifted into sleep that night, the sky began to whisper of storms to come. But for now, there was only the steady breath of beasts, the scent of wine resting in shadowed oak, and the sound of the road still waiting just beyond the firelight. The first drops came just before dawn, soft as fingertips against canvas. Etienne stirred beneath the blanket, grumbled, and pulled it over his head. Gerault was already awake, listening to the rain with the stillness of someone who'd heard too many kinds of storms to misjudge one. This was not a squall. This was not a passing drizzle. This was the kind of rain that soaked through stone and memory alike. He rose, checked the ropes, adjusted the canvas cover over the barrels, double-folded the flap near the front. By the time Etienne sat up, hair tousled, the drizzle had thickened to a steady curtain. They broke camp without words. Gerault handed Etienne a slice of cold bread, and they were moving before the sun had fully pulled itself above the horizon. The road was narrow now, pressed between rock and river, the mud sucking at the wheels like it wanted to swallow them whole. The oxen plodded forward with quiet resolve, their eyes half-lidded, their breath rising in steamy puffs. Etienne tried to keep spirits up with a tune, but the rain stole the notes before they could take shape. By midday, the cart began to lean. Not sharply, just slightly, enough for Gerault to notice the shift in balance. He halted the oxen, knelt beside the left rear wheel. The earth beneath was softening. Too much weight, too much water. He adjusted the load, moved one barrel slightly forward, added a stone beneath the axle. Etienne watched with furrowed brow. "You think it'll hold?" "It has to." The next village was still 2 days off. They continued. The rain blurred the world. Trees became smudges. Hills melted into sky. The road narrowed further, then vanished into a pass between 2 ridges. The rock wet and slick underfoot. There, a wheel slipped. The cart jolted. One of the ropes snapped with a sharp twang. A barrel rolled slightly, caught only by Gerault's quick grip. He swore under his breath, teeth clenched. Etienne scrambled to help, but Gerault waved him back. "Stay by the oxen," he said. The boy obeyed, hands gripping the lead rope like a lifeline. Gerault moved carefully, retying the broken strap, shifting the load again, checking every knot. Rain poured down his neck, soaked his sleeves, filled the cracks in his boots. But the cart held. They made it through the pass by dusk, descending into a hollow where the land flattened and the wind eased. Gerault found a patch of gravel near a cluster of birch trees, high enough to avoid flooding, wide enough for the cart to rest level. He built a fire beneath a lean-to of canvas and branches. Etienne, shivering, peeled off his damp outer shirt and hung it beside the flames. "Do you think the barrels are all right?" he asked. Gerault didn't answer immediately. He pulled one from the cart, inspected the seal, listened closely. "No leaks. They're fine," he said. "So far." The rain continued through the night, soft now, steady as breath. As they drifted into sleep, Gerault thought of Saint-Étienne, just over the next ridge if the merchant's map was true. One more stretch, one more push. Then perhaps, just perhaps, rest. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought curled around his mind like warmth. And the barrels, like old companions, rested in silence, dreaming of tables and candles and quiet celebration. The next morning brought stillness. Not sun, not blue sky, just the absence of rain, which was its own kind of blessing. Mist clung to the hills, rising in thin sheets, as if the land were sighing after a long weep. Gerault stirred slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his knees, the mild ache that had grown into an old friend. He checked the barrels first, running his hand across the damp wood, cool to the touch, but sealed tight. No swelling, no leaks, a good sign. Etienne, rubbing sleep from his eyes, was already folding the blanket with the practiced awkwardness of a boy trying to impress. They broke camp in silence, the kind that needed no apology. The oxen stepped cautiously at first, hooves hesitant after the slick stone of the ridge, but the path began to widen and firm beneath them. Mossy grass crept back into view. The trees thinned. And then, in the middle distance, almost hidden by the morning veil, they saw it. Saint-Étienne. Not grand, not spired like Tours, but solid. Built low to the hills, roofs the colour of old pewter, smoke curling from chimneys. Bells echoed faintly, announcing mass or simply marking time. Etienne let out a low whistle. "We made it." Gerault said nothing. His eyes remained on the road. As they approached, a group of children ran ahead of them, shouting, "Wine wagon!" Whether by habit or simple joy, it was hard to tell. A man with a cap of faded velvet waved them toward the side gate near the church square. Behind him, rows of barrels waited on benches, some already being rolled into storage. The merchant was there, pacing with a ledger in one hand, a strip of dried plum in the other. "You're 2 days early," he said, not unkindly. "We followed the river." The merchant nodded, walked to the cart, inspected the cargo with a quick eye. "No swelling," he murmured, tapping one cask. "Good temperature, no rot, and dry seals." He turned to Gerault. "You're either lucky or honest." Gerault handed him the delivery slip. The merchant scribbled a mark, then opened his pouch and pressed silver into the hauler's hand. "Take rest in the greenhouse near the square," he said. "They serve stew worth the salt." Etienne's eyes widened at the mention of stew. Gerault nodded. "We'll see." They guided the oxen to the back lot, unloaded the barrels carefully, each one rolling down the plank like a child arriving home. The merchant's men took over then, filing them into the cellar with practiced hands. Gerault watched only long enough to be sure none were dropped, then turned away. They walked back through the square. A girl was playing a tune on a wooden pipe, slightly off-key but sweet. Etienne dropped a pebble into her bowl, grinning. The inn, called simply The Vine, smelled of roast onions and worn leather. Inside, a fire crackled, and a bent old woman greeted them with a smile that didn't ask questions. "Stew for both?" Gerault nodded. They sat. They ate. Slowly. And for once, they didn't talk about where they were going next. They just let themselves be still. Outside, the bells rang again. But inside, everything was quiet. The inn was warm in the way only old buildings could be, thick-walled, low-beamed, with the scent of stew clinging to the stones, as if it had been simmering there for generations. Etienne fell asleep in his bowl, his chin resting just beside a crust of bread he'd forgotten to finish. Gerault sat across from him, sipping slowly from a cup of thin red wine, the kind poured from the back of a cask, more for warmth than flavour. The old woman who ran the place, Madame Law, watched them with the queue, at patience of someone who'd seen many men come through town carrying weight they didn't speak of. She didn't press Gerault for stories. She simply brought a blanket, draped it over the boy, and left another pitcher by the hearth. Later, when the room had emptied and the fire dimmed to glowing coals, she spoke. "You've been hauling a long time." Gerault nodded. "You planning to keep going?" He stared into the fire. "I always think I'll stop, then I don't." She poured herself a thimble's worth of wine and sipped. "Maybe you're not done yet, or maybe you're just used to moving." Gerault didn't answer, but her words followed him upstairs into a room with sheets that smelled of lavender and windows that rattled faintly in the breeze. He dreamt that night of barrels floating down a river with no end. He stood on the bank, calling to them, but they didn't turn back. They just drifted on, round and steady and utterly silent. Morning came with golden light pushing gently through the shutters. Etienne stirred in his sleep, mumbling nonsense. Gerault rose, stretched, and stood for a while at the window watching the town stir. Chimneys smoking, chickens wandering, a boy in the square chasing a hoop with a stick. He didn't feel rested exactly, but he didn't feel weary either. Downstairs, Madame Law had hot bread and chicory waiting. She offered more than a few glances at Etienne, who was helping sweep the front step with exaggerated flair. "Good hands," she said. "Quick feet too. If you're not planning to keep him, someone else will." Gerault looked at the boy, then at his own calloused hands. "He's not mine," he said. Madame Law shrugged. "Road doesn't care whose blood you share, only who stays." They stayed another day, not from need, but because the fire felt right and the stew tasted like stories. Gerault patched a strap on the cart. Etienne helped unload crates for a Gerault in exchange for 2 apples and a story about pirates that he later insisted was true. That evening, as they sat outside under a sky bruised purple with dusk, Etienne finally asked the question he'd been holding. "Do you think we could find work here?" Gerault tilted his head. "You want to?" Etienne shrugged. "Maybe. I like the bread." Gerault considered it. The road had quieted. The oxen were rested. The cart needed only minor repair. "You could," he said. "You're young. They'd take you on." Etienne picked at a splinter on the bench. "Would you stay?" The fire crackled behind them. Someone played a fiddle in the distance, badly, but with heart. Gerault looked up at the stars. "I don't know yet," he said. He didn't lie. Some roads waited, no matter how far you travelled. The days in Saint-Étienne began to blend, each one gentler than the last. Etienne found work sweeping the merchant stalls before the morning bell, and in return received coin enough for soup and coins enough for questions. He liked being known, he confessed to Gerault one night. Not known for stories, but just known. Gerault watched from the edge of it all. He visited the stable each morning to check the oxen, walked the square with hands behind his back, spoke little but listened always. People began to nod to him. The baker's son waved. Even Madame Law started placing a mug for him before he arrived. Yet each evening he would walk the edge of town, past the tannery, along the low wall where the road picked up again, south toward nowhere in particular. The road still spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, but like an old friend who wasn't quite ready to let go. One afternoon, while Etienne helped repair a wagon axle behind the smithy, a young woman approached Gerault. She wore a blue kerchief and carried a bundle of letters tied with twine. "You're the hauler from Mersault?" Gerault nodded. "My uncle, Henri, said you brought wine through the pass 2 winters ago. Said you made it when others turned back." Gerault raised an eyebrow. "He said," the woman continued, "if I ever needed something moved without fuss, to look for a man who didn't flinch at snow." She untied the twine. Inside, a contract. 3 casks of violet dye, headed for a monastery east of Lyon. Fragile, expensive, needed careful hands. Gerault read it, felt the old rhythm slide back into place behind his eyes. "Leaves next week," she said, "if you're willing." He didn't answer immediately, just looked down at the lines, at the fine print, at the space where his name would go. "Let me think," he said. He carried the papers back to the inn, tucked them beneath his blanket. That evening, Etienne returned, arms covered in soot, a proud look on his face. "They let me try the forge bellows," he said. "It's heavier than it looks." Gerault smiled, a small thing, rare and real. They ate in silence. Then Etienne asked, "Are we staying?" Gerault looked at him. The boy's cheeks were flushed, eyes bright, fingers still twitching from work. "Do you want to?" Etienne hesitated, then nodded. "I think maybe I do." Gerault took a slow sip from his mug, then set it down. "There's a job south. Careful cargo." Etienne's shoulders fell slightly. "So we're leaving?" Gerault reached into his coat, pulled out the papers, and placed them on the table. "No," he said, "but I might be." The boy stared. "You'd go without me?" "If you wanted to stay." A silence passed between them, not bitter, not sharp, just wide. "I don't know," Etienne said finally. "I don't know yet." "That's all right," Gerault replied. "Road'll wait." They sat like that a while, old man and boy, contract and hearthlight, words and all their quiet spaces. Sometimes the decision was not to decide just yet. Sometimes that was enough. The following days settled over them like a warm blanket, familiar, comforting, and just heavy enough to make moving seem unnecessary. Etienne fell into the rhythm of town life with a grace Gerault both admired and feared. The boy fetched water for the inn, patched leather for the cobbler, and learned the names of every goat and dog along the south lane. He laughed more easily now, walked with his chest out, and came home each night with a new story stitched into his grin. Gerault said little, but watched everything. The oxen grew restless with inaction, muscles twitching beneath their hides as if they too remembered the feel of the road. He brushed them daily, oiled the harness, mended the reins. But they stood in the stable, chewing slowly, their breath heavy with boredom. The contract for the violet dye sat folded in the drawer by his bed, untouched but not forgotten. One evening, Gerault sat outside the inn, sharpening his knife on a smooth river stone. The sound was quiet, rhythmic, the same way he used to count distance between towns, not by leagues but by the wear on his blade. Madame Laure brought him a plate of salted fish and rye, placed it on the table without comment, and sat across from him. "You've been looking west," she said. Gerault paused. "Out of habit." "That boy's nearly rooted here, you notice?" "I noticed." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You thinking of pulling him up?" Gerault glanced at the street where Etienne was racing two girls with a stick and a wheel. "No," he said, I'm just wondering if I've stopped." Laure leaned back, considering. "Stopping isn't quitting," she said. "Sometimes it's just noticing you've arrived." The knife made another pass across the stone, then paused. "That sounds like something a woman says to a man when she's about to make him stay," Gerault said. She smiled faintly. "Only if he wants to." That night, Etienne's. He came in late, cheeks flushed, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside Gerault's chair. "I could apprentice with the wheelwright," he said. Gerault looked down. "Good work," he said. "Hard work." Gerault nodded. They sat in silence, firelight dancing across the stone walls. "I'd still come with you sometimes," Etienne added, "if you wanted." Gerault rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Maybe it's your turn to stay," he said. The words weren't heavy. They didn't fall like a decision, but like a door creaking open. And yet, something in the air shifted. The next morning, Gerault rose before dawn. He saddled the oxen, not to leave, but to walk them to the far edge of town and back. A quiet routine, a chance to hear what the road might say. It said nothing. Or perhaps it said, "Wait," and so he did. At least, for now. Gerault walked the oxen along the dew-laced path just past the chapel wall, the leather reins draped lightly in his hand. Morning birds called softly from the hedges, and the scent of baking rye drifted faintly on the breeze. The animals ambled without urgency, content in the familiar drag of hooves on packed dirt. Each step felt less like a journey and more like a ritual, a way to keep the body in motion while the heart stayed still. He passed the same markers each time, the leaning milestone, half buried and worn smooth, the iron fence covered in ivy that led to the brewer's orchard, the large flat stone that Etienne once declared looked exactly like the back of an old turtle. These things did not move, and yet they felt different every morning. Or maybe Gerault was the one changing, and everything else simply remained as it was. Back in town, shopkeepers were setting out their wares. The tailor's apprentice nodded at him, thread still caught in her hair. A cart full of carrots wobbled down the road, driven by a boy no older than 12 who handled the ray, ends with too much confidence and not enough care. As he approached the inn, Etienne was already waiting on the stoop, arms folded, eyes bright. "I fed them," he said proudly, referring to the oxen. "I know," Gerault replied. "They look smug." Etienne grinned, then sat on the step, elbows resting on his knees. "The wheelwright says I've got the hands for shaping spokes. Says I listen better than his last two boys." Gerault nodded. "You've got the hands for it." A pause. "You think it's all right to want to stay?" Etienne asked. Gerault looked down at him. The boy who had once followed him through mud and sleet, over hills and past shrines, who had carved notches for every village, who had once slept curled around a barley sack like it was a pillow from home. "It's more than all right," he said quietly. It's the point. Etienne was silent a moment, watching a blackbird peck at a crust near the gutter. You'll keep going, though, won't you? I don't know yet. The boy frowned, then nodded, as if accepting the answer not because he liked it, but because he understood it was honest. That afternoon, Gerault returned to the merchant's house with the contract still folded in his coat. He stepped inside the cool stone building, smelled ink and must and polished wood. The young woman was behind the desk again, stacking documents. I haven't signed it, he said. She looked up. No? He placed the paper on the desk, smoothing the edges with careful fingers. Not this time. She didn't look surprised. You sure? He nodded. The road doesn't mind if you say no. It just waits. She smiled slightly. Maybe you'll say yes another time. Maybe. When he stepped out into the sunlight again, it felt warmer. Not because of the weather, but because he had chosen the stillness rather than fallen into it. That evening, Etienne showed him the first spindle he'd carved, a little uneven but solid. I'm going to paint it red, the boy said. Gerault examined it, ran his thumb along the curve. Good, he murmured. Let it be yours, and beneath the hum of dusk and chimney smoke he felt, perhaps for the first time in many winters, that he was no longer just passing through. The next morning was warm in the way early spring often promised, but rarely delivered, sunlight soft, like a hand resting lightly on the shoulder, and the wind holding only the faintest chill, as if even it had grown tired of biting. The market square bustled gently, with no urgency, just the rhythm of a town that had learned patience across generations. Gerault sat near the fountain, his back resting against the worn stone where saints had once been carved. The details had long since faded, their features weathered into mystery, but the outlines remained. Like memories softened by time, still meaningful even without precision. Etienne passed by with a bucket of nails and a mouth full of questions for the blacksmith. He offered a wave without slowing, boots scuffed, curls wild. Gerault lifted 2 fingers in return. That had become their language now, simple, unspoken, steady. He stayed by the fountain, most of the morning, watching life unfold around him. An old man argued softly with a goat. A woman dropped a loaf of bread and chased it halfway down the road. Children tied ribbons to the arms of a wooden cross, laughing, not knowing if it was for a festival or simply for fun. When the sun crested the rooftops, Gerault rose and walked. Not out of town, not toward any road, but into the alleys and back lanes where small doors stood open and cats watched from window sills. He passed a courtyard where a boy practiced the lute, missing more notes than he caught. He passed a courtyard where a man hung wet linen that caught the light, like flags of surrender. He ended up near the edge of town, where the path sloped down to the river. There, by the stone bridge, he saw a cart much like his own, though newer, brighter. A young hauler stood beside it, arguing with his oxen in the manner of some, one too proud to admit they were lost. Gerault approached quietly. "Wheels too narrow for this road," he said. The young man blinked. "Says." Gerault nodded at the cart. "You'll rattle the casks. Take the lower road. It's slower, but the gravel's even." The hauler hesitated, then nodded. "You done this route before?" Gerault gave the faintest smile. "A few times." The hauler looked him over. "You don't haul anymore?" "Sometimes," Gerault said, "when the road calls." The younger man seemed to take this in like a lesson, and with a quiet, "Thank you," he guided his cart down the gentler path. Gerault remained by the bridge for a while longer, listening to the water slip past the stones. He could have taken that path himself days ago, could have signed the contract, could have gone east with the barrels. But he hadn't. And today, the road hadn't pulled at him. It had simply passed beneath someone else's wheels. By the time he returned to the inn, Etienne had finished his day's work and was carving again, this time a tiny ox, legs stumpy but strong. Gerault sat beside him and watched. "You're getting better," he said. Etienne didn't look up. "I know." And for a time, they said nothing more. Because sometimes stillness speaks louder than footsteps. It rained the next day, but the kind of rain that made things softer, not harsher. The kind that rinsed roofs and coaxed green from the hedgerows. Gerault sat beneath the eaves of the cooper's shop, watching droplets race down the gutter and listening to the low, rhythmic thud of casks being shaped inside. It was a soothing sound, familiar in its way, like heartbeats in oak. Etienne was inside too, helping the cooper's apprentice oil a finished barrel. The boy was covered in sawdust and glue, his sleeves rolled high, eyes bright with concentration. Every now and then, a cough of laughter would emerge, the kind that only came from those two immersed in their work to realize how much they loved it. Gerault watched, then leaned his head back against the wall, a dog trotting, by, soaked and unconcerned. Across the square, Madame Laure swept the inn's step with a purpose that defied the falling rain. She caught his eye and smiled without stopping. The sky rumbled once, not a threat, just a reminder of distance. Gerault thought of the roads he had taken, the ones that curved out of sight, the ones that never ended where maps said they would. He thought of passes that broke wagons and of strangers who offered shelter with more kindness than words. And then he thought of the road he hadn't taken this time, not out of fear, not even out of fatigue, but because for once he didn't need to chase anything. When Etienne emerged from the cooper's shop, hands stained and face streaked with effort, he carried something wrapped in cloth. "I made it," he said, unwrapping the bundle carefully. Inside was a cup, wooden, small, uneven, but it had a rim and a base, and it held water. "For you," he added. Gerault took it, turning it in his hands. "It's not perfect," the boy admitted. "It's enough," Gerault replied. And he meant it. They walked back to the inn together, boots leaving quiet marks in the softening earth. Inside, the fire was already going. The smell of onions and rosemary filled the air. Gerault sat at the hearth, the cup in his lap, while Etienne dried off and fetched a bowl of stew for them to share. They didn't speak much over dinner, but as the fire burned low, Etienne finally asked, "If you do go again, will you come back?" Gerault looked at him, really looked. At the hands beginning to callous, at the eyes beginning to see more than wonder, at the boy who had once followed a stranger's cart and now carved his own path. "Yes," he said. "If I go, I'll come back." It was a promise spoken not with grand weight, but with the gentle truth of a man who no longer ran from silence. The rain eased into mist. The fire crackled on, and the road just beyond the window waited patiently, not as a command, but as an invitation. The rain drifted away overnight, leaving behind a morning washed clean. The cobblestones gleamed under early sun, and puddles mirrored rooftops as if the town had doubled itself in the night. Gerault stood by the stable, brushing one of the oxen with long, even strokes. The creature leaned into the motion, eyes half closed in bovine contentment. He had begun to enjoy these small repeated acts. Mending a harness not for the sake of a journey, but simply because it needed care. Checking the wheel rims without the pressure of departure. For the first time in many years, maintenance had become less about readiness and more about relationship. Etienne wandered up a moment later, his apron slung over one shoulder, a bit of ash smudged across his cheek. "Market's early today," he said, gesturing toward the square where stalls were already being erected. "They say there's a festival coming." "What kind?" Gerault asked. "The spring barrels," Etienne said. "They tap last year's wines and tell stories about the vines. Everyone pretends to know what tannin means." Gerault chuckled softly. "They do that in Meursault too." "You ever stay for one?" Gerault shook his head. "I was always delivering to it, never through it." "Well," Etienne said, straightening, "you're invited this time." Gerault considered that. The days flowed easily after that, each one wrapped in the slow, golden light of early spring, when life feels as though it's being restitched with gentle fingers. Gerault continued his walks, sometimes with Etienne, sometimes alone. He sat in the square and listened to the lute player who had finally learned his second tune. He shared bread with the same dog that had passed him weeks before. He mended not just tools, but fences and steps and friendships, some of which he hadn't known were his to begin with. People started referring to him without pointing. "The hauler," they said, or Gerault, who helped with the barrel straps. He was no longer a stranger, he was just someone who was here. When the spring festival came, Etienne carved a small cup to be hung on the barrel pole, a tradition Gerault had never heard of, but which he didn't question. The boy carried it with pride to the square, tied it with a bit of blue cloth, and watched as the townsfolk smiled at the addition. That night, after the wine had flowed and the tales had been told, tales that grew wilder with each refill, Gerault sat beneath a canopy of lanterns watching Etienne dance in a clumsy, joyful circle with other apprentices. The music was fast, the laughter faster, and there was no room in the air for loneliness. Madame Laure passed by and placed a mug in Gerault's hand. "Still here?" she said with a grin. "For now," he answered. She tilted her head. "Think it might be for good?" He took a sip. It was the merchant's wine from months before, smoother now, fuller, the kind that had settled into itself. "Maybe," Gerault said. "Maybe I've settled too." And he smiled. Not because the road had ended, but because it had, at last, brought him home. Spring folded gently into early summer. The days lengthened until twilight seemed to stretch forever, lingering over rooftops and courtyards like a blanket not yet ready to be drawn aside. Gerault moved through the town now as though he'd always been part of its rhythm. His boots familiar to the streets, his nods returned without hesitation, his silences understood. The oxen had taken to grazing in the back meadow behind the cooper's yard, no longer tied, simply trusted. They stayed close, chewing and blinking slowly at passers-by, content in their unhurried retirement. The cart stood beneath a canvas lean-to, oiled and whole, but untouched for weeks. Every so often, Gerault would run a hand along its side, checking for wear, more from habit than need. Etienne had grown into his role at the workshop. The blacksmith had even begun to let him work iron without supervision, though the boy still favoured wood in his free time, carving, sanding, shaping small figures and wheels. He'd made a name for himself as someone whose hands could bring quiet to chaos, which Gerault found both fitting and oddly familiar. The town, too, seemed to breathe easier with him there. One morning, as the air hummed with the scent of lavender and fresh mortar, the merchant who'd offered the violet dye contract returned to Saint-Étienne. She found Gerault sitting outside the inn, patching a bit of cracked leather. Her cart stood nearby, cleaner than before, but familiar. "Still not moving?" she asked, gesturing to the untouched cart. Gerault looked up. "I've moved enough." She tilted her head. "You sure? There's work again. Avignon this time." "I'm sure," he said. She smiled, as though relieved. "Good. That road's long, and you're better suited to quiet towns than long hills now." They shared a mug of cider and talked not of wine or barrels, but of weather and bread and the small changes in the cobblestones since winter. When she left, she didn't press a paper into his hands. She simply said, "If you change your mind, you'll know where I am." And Gerault nodded, not because he would change it, but because he liked that the choice remained. That evening, Etienne brought him a new carving, a tiny replica of the cart, complete with etched wheels and a miniature barrel tied atop it. "For the shelf," he said, placing it beside the wooden ox Gerault had received months before. Gerault held the little cart in his palm, felt its weight, light but steady. "It's good work," he said. "I had a good teacher," the boy replied. The fire crackled nearby. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the square. Somewhere, a lute began its evening tune, slightly out of tune, but familiar all the same. Gerault leaned back, letting the warmth of the hearth settle into his bones. He had walked countless roads, followed rivers, climbed passes, braved winters. He had lost barrels, found towns, made friends and left them. But here the road had ended, not in silence, but in stillness, not in absence, but in presence. No grand farewell, no final trail to trace, just the soft, enduring hum of belonging. And the knowledge that sometimes home isn't a place you find. Sometimes it's the place that lets you stop searching.